Dialogue trees are a fantastic way to inject interest and interactivity and narrative into basically any game or app. It starts with AAA titles having their dialogue trees, but there are games that couldn't exist without dialogue trees, even on the like indie part of the spectrum. And then there are games that are basically little else than dialogue trees, and they're very successful and very fun to play. So dialog trees are a big deal. Now, in this video, we're going to show how to implement dialog trees in Flutter. Before we get into the nitty-gritty details of actually implementing this, I want to dwell a little bit more on the fact that dialog trees can kind of uplift the experience of the user a lot. For little, like you don't need to do a lot in terms of development, and yet you get a lot of added value. So, and not just in games, but also in apps, I think, like you can imagine an onboarding process with, selecting what you want to do and then like having a little conversation instead of just like reading a lot of text and then deciding what to do, right? So it's when you would normally have either nothing, so like a game, for example, that is a platformer, and then at the end of a session, you just say like, yeah, you won the session, let's go for the next one. And thanks to dialogue trees, you can add more narration. You can be like, okay, so what just happened? What's next? You can make the characters evolve. It just can be more interesting from simple things. So it can add something where there was nothing, or it can transform something that would be otherwise kind of boring or even annoying into something that is actually fun. So for example, let's say again you have a platformer, and at the end, for the game to make any sense, you want to have some kind of info dump. You want the person who's playing to know what this all means, who the character is, why are they, picking up all the coins or whatever. And if you want to do that, you can show a big text and then, like a big chunk of text and then a button at the end. And that kind of works, but to be honest, for like 99% of people, that's just like a hard pass. They will just click next or skip or whatever. But if you are able to make it interesting, people will not even recognize that they have an info dump going. They will see it as part of the experience. And again, AAA big titles have been doing this for decades now, and many other games, indie games, have been very successful with using it as well. So let's actually learn how to do it. All right, so let's have a look at an existing system. I'm showing you a demo that I wrote, a couple of days ago that is trying to show how to use Yard Spinner, which is one kind of language that can be used to create dialogue trees. And this is actually on the web, so you can play with it. You can see the code. What you're seeing here is the code in the Yarn language, and we'll go through it step by step, so you know what's going on. We can then talk about how to implement the system below it. But before that, we need to first understand what's going on. So first of all, why is it called dialogue trees? You can maybe see it here because you write dialogues and interactive content like this by basically building these trees. This is a tree where you talk to, this is inspired by Harry Potter. I did not write this, by the way. This is part of the Jenny documentation. That's a package we'll talk about. And so you have like someone talks to you, Professor Slughorn talks to you. Let me restart. Oh, hello, Tom. Is there anything I can help you with? And then you go next. Good afternoon, Professor. Cool. And then next, and you get choices, right? And that's like a start of a, like, that's a tree, right? This goes down, and then you could imagine that there's another tree like this where you can go and ask other questions to the player, like how they want to continue. And by putting these trees together, you will basically create this interactivity and this dialogue that we want to have. So now you've seen, okay, there's the line. You see the line. The line is actually very short. It's something that a normal person can read in like a few seconds at most. This is important because, again, people don't like to read big blocks of text. You can get them to it. In the end, they might be able and might be willing to read a lot of text, but especially at the start, they are not willing to do it. So there's this, and then you need to make an action to get to the next quote or the next line of dialogue. This is, again, important, and this is part of what makes dialogue trees tick. So we're on this line, and here you can see that we're calling a function that goes back to our system, right? So for example, this can be time of day in the game. I have it hooked up to the actual time, so it's an afternoon right now, so it says good afternoon, Professor. But anyway, it could be anything, right? So that's one thing that you need to have implemented often in dialog trees, is being able to ask the game state what's up, right? And then we go to this fork where we want to ask the player to make their choice. And so that I was curious, I wanted to ask, I just wanted to say. So these are the three choices, and then whatever you choose, you get to there, right? And then you can also not only ask about the state of the game right now, you can also change it in some way. So that's another very important part of dialogue trees. If you have a dialogue trees if you have a dialogue in your game and it does nothing, it's still valuable because it goes through some kind of narrative in a way that doesn't frustrate the player. But it's much better if what they actually choose during the dialogue matters in the game, right? Like you can be like, oh, okay, so I'll help the person, and so this will take away some of my coin, but will give me some kind of karma or whatever, and then I can use that karma in the upcoming level or whatever. So that's important. You have to have a two-way communication system between this and the game, right? So now hopefully you have kind of a very shallow but broad understanding of what dialogue trees look like when they're written down and when you play them. But let's see how they are kind of implemented on the lower level. In my little demo, I'm using a Dart package called Jenny, which implements part of, or maybe all of, a language for dialogue trees called Yarn Spinner. Yarn Spinner is one of the more popular ones, but obviously it's just one example, right? Now, you might be tempted to implement all of this yourself from scratch. And I'm gonna let you know why that's probably a bad idea. But at first, like, you could see the appeal, right? You don't need to depend on anything. You don't need to learn a new weird language like Yarn, and instead you can just write in Dart. In fact, this is something that I wanted to do when I first encountered the need to build dialog trees. And the fact is that it's actually really much more complicated than it looks like. You basically have to create your own virtual machine. Even if you write your quotes and lines into Dart as strings, and even if you put your choices into some kind of like a class that has, a list of choice instances and so on and so forth, you can avoid having to write a language like Yarn, like this guy, but you still have to deal with things like, okay, so obviously we need to yield from the system, right? So here we have a dialog runner, and once it emits some line, right? It should not continue until we tell it to continue, right? Otherwise, this would not work. Like you'd have, oh, hello, Tom, is there anything I can help you with? And the player needs to first say something or click next before going to the next line, right? And then the same, obviously, for the choices. And then when you click a choice, only then you run some kind of a callback or something like this. So that in itself is not as bad, right? Because we have yield in Dart, so that would work. But then you realize, oh, but I also need to serialize. I need to store the state of the dialogue at any given point so that I can reload it. Like if, for example, if I closed this demo and came back, if it wasn't a demo but an actual app or game, I would like to come back to here and not come back to the start of the dialogue, right? So we need some way to serialize where we are in that dialogue, and so on and so forth. There's so many things that you realize, oh, I actually need to do that. In the end, you basically have a VM with things like variables that are just for the dialogue. Oftentimes, the dialogue kind of has to track the nodes that have been already visited. As you can maybe see in the Yarn, this is like a very simple little Yarn project, right? But it has two sections, and you have things like jumping, basically go-to statements, which normally are a terrible idea, but for something like a dialog tree, it is actually very, very useful. So all that, I think, brings you back to just using something that's already there. And I really see 2 to 3 options right now in Flutter. One of them is Jenny, which is well maintained, and it is basically implementing something that is very kind of an industry standard for dialog trees, and that is called Jenny. So it's this guy, Jenny, and it implements a system called Yarn Spinner. There is another one that I'm very fond of called Ink, by a company called Inkle. I think it's a little simpler in terms of how it looks like, but it's very similar. In the end, they are all very similar, and there is a package that I know of that implements Ink, and so you can choose between the two. And of course, if you like the challenge, you can definitely write your own, especially if you know that your use of dialog trees will be limited, then that's great. The reason why we have things like Yarn, we have like basically domain specific languages just for dialog trees, is that these things are often shared with writers, with people who are not so used to using programming languages, but are more likely to be able to write good, interesting text, right? Of course, I should say it doesn't need to be only text, right? This, for example, could say, okay, I wanna I wanna say something, or I wanna play a sound, or make an animation. Similarly, you could do whatever you want with the text that is given to you from the system. So maybe you have, for each of the lines, you have a sound file that can be played. In that case, you can just have the sound files here, or like the names of the sound files, and then you just, in the Flutter app, you just play the sound file, right? All right. So what do we have here? I just want to go through like the very simple implementation of Jenny. They have a mixin called dialog view that gives you things like, for example, on choice start and on dialog finish and online start. And then in the init script, so what we have here is you get a script, which is literally just a string. In our case, we just take it from assets, but it could be a string that is hard coded into your app. And then then you start a yarn project, and then you say what will be the functions that you are able to call from the script or from the dialog tree. You saw the time of day, I think, right? No, not this one. That's here. Just calling functions like normally. You can, of course, have functions with higher arity. So like you can actually send something, like, you could have luck and then send an integer or random integer or something like this. And then you also have commands, what they call commands, which is basically like, just give command is right here. Where is it? Oh yeah, give restricted library pass an arity of 1. You actually give it some string, and we implement it here, right? So this is just a normal method. It could be a function, a closure, whatever. And in our case, we just show a snack bar. The player was given this and this item. But of course, in a game, you would be able to actually give them the item into their inventory and so on and so forth. Same with time of day. We are actually calling it. Then we find out what the actual time is, and then depending on that, we get a string back. And achievement is very similar. And then when the yarn project is set up like that, we can just parse the text, and we have our project. And then we need the runner to run the project, and that is very easy. You can just like say, okay, yeah, I need a dialog runner from this project, and then you can have several views, and one of them is, as you can see, this, and that's because we are mixing in the dialog view, right? But like in a game, you could be, okay, so there's just one script, or just one dialog runner, but several views. And the view can be, okay, so maybe the speech bubbles are one view, and they just check what is being said and they update their text. But another view could be the I don't know, the characters in your game could start, doing this whenever they're speaking, and so they just implement the on dialog start or whatever, or on new online start, and start talking. So that's all possible. and then you just start dialogue, and you say which subscript to start with. It's like the main function or whatever of your of what you're trying to do, and or entry point, I guess. And that's basically it in terms of initialization. But then of course, where are we? Then of course you have to implement things like, okay, so if I'm finished with the dialogue, I set state in my case. If I start a new line, I need to actually set state with the current line. So that's what this shows, and this as well. And then if I finish dialogue, yeah, I already did that. And when there's a new choice, that's a dialogue choice, a class, and then I'm showing a modal bottom sheet, which is what you see here. And then I can show all the options and somehow do things with them. Like I can complete the the future with the option that was selected. So you can read the code yourself. I don't want to go into too much detail, but actually it's pretty simple, especially if you have only text and maybe some sound and some choices. So that's that. All right, and before I end, I want to give you some best practices in writing these things, although I know that you might not be the person who's actually writing the narrative, but nevertheless, I think it's nice to know what should be done or not. So in games, generally speaking, you want as much interactivity as frequently as possible, right? So you don't want to have very long phrases or very long times when you're just like clicking next. You want to be able to have little choices. And these choices can really be kind of little, like, like, do I say yes, sir, or do I say sure? And even that is a little bit of something to choose from. Ideally, even that choice has meaning. So later, maybe the person the player is talking to can be either okay with it, or they can be a little bit annoyed that you don't call them sir or whatever. This is all good. But even without, sometimes you can just have a choice that is just there for the person to be able to, they're still kind of in the game, they're driving it. It's not just them clicking next, right? So that's one thing. Another very important and very useful thing that you can see in a lot of the cutscenes in AAA games is what I call at least, delayed reaction. So you start, maybe you like end a level or whatever, and you start talking to someone, and then the very first choice seems meaningless. Like it's something like, okay, do you want to sit or do you want to keep standing? And then you say, I don't care, or I'll sit or I'll keep standing. And then there is basically no reaction to that. In this case, that makes no sense because you would either sit or stand. But it could be something like the yes, sir, or sure scenario. So there's almost no reaction to this. But you use the variables inside your dialogue tree system to remember that what the player said. And then maybe like 5 lines or 5 minutes after this, you remember this variable in your code, and you say, and you somehow make a callback to it. And I mean callback in the literally sense. So you can say things like, oh, well, I know that you call me sir now, so you don't need to call me. By the way, you don't need to call me sir anymore, right? And if you do that a long time after the yes sir happened, then people will feel like they're actually having a conversation instead of just like, going through dialogue tree. So that's a really good one. And then of course scoping, as always. If you have a game that is mostly about being a platformer, then there is no need to make huge dialogue trees. You probably want them to keep short so that the player can get back to playing, obviously. On the other hand, if you have a game that is some kind of epic and there's a lot of reading involved anyway, then yes, you can have very interesting, very intricate dialogues. So keep kind of in your lane, and people will be happy. But just don't think that it's like a lot. I think some game developers think that dialogues are useless and that games should all only be gaming, but that's not the case. A lot of the experience of games is being able to kind of live in the world of the game and to have some kind of connection to the characters, same as like in television series or books or anywhere else. And for that, you often need to have some kind of conversation. And you don't want to just show it to people, you want people to be able to participate in it. So that's it. Thanks for watching. I hope this was useful, and see you next time.